The whole auction yard laughed when CEO Evelyn Carter pointed at 5 wrecked prototypes rotting in the rain and announced that Mason Reed, a broke single father, deserved nothing better than $500 of scrap metal. Mason said nothing. He signed the papers, towed each car back to his rundown garage, and spent 6 silent months turning them into something the entire electric vehicle industry would soon be desperate to claim. 6 months later, that same Evelyn Carter stood trembling on his doorstep, holding a $500 million contract, begging to buy back the cars she had mocked. If you want to see how Mason turned humiliation into a $500 million empire, watch until the end. The rain came down hard over the salvage auction lot on the edge of Detroit, drumming against sheets of corrugated metal and pooling in oily puddles across the cracked concrete. 5 electric prototypes sat beneath a row of sagging tarps, each one tagged with a single phrase that read no remaining functional value. The paint on their hoods had blistered, their control panels were dark, and rust had already begun creeping along the exposed seams where the rain had been getting in for weeks. Mason Reed arrived on foot, wearing a faded mechanic jacket and boots that had been resoled more times than he could remember. He carried a worn notebook filled with technical sketches, the kind of notebook a man keeps when he has spent his whole life solving problems other people walk away from. He did not look like an investor. He did not look like anyone who belonged at a corporate liquidation sale. He looked, more than anything, like a man searching for spare parts he could still use. Evelyn Carter swept in a few minutes later, trailed by a small entourage of assistants, lawyers, and senior engineers from Carter Motors. She was there to quietly dispose of the wreckage from a failed internal program, a project that had drained tens of millions of dollars and now threatened to expose a deeper hole in the company's finances if anyone on the board looked too closely. The 5 vehicles being sold that morning were the abandoned remains of a solid-state battery initiative Carter Motors had buried 2 years earlier. From the outside, the cars looked beyond saving. Their frames were scorched and dented, their control systems unresponsive, their charging ports corroded shut. None of them could start. Grace Madison, who ran the auction yard, announced an opening price low enough to reflect what everyone assumed was true, that nobody in their right mind would want 5 dangerous, broken hulks of machinery rusting in the weather. Mason crouched beside the nearest one anyway, running his fingers along the faded chassis markings and the half-legible connector codes stamped into the battery housing. Something about the pattern caught his attention, a pattern he had seen before in fragments, never in one place at once. He realized, slowly, that these were not 5 separate failures. They were 5 pieces of a single experimental system that had been pulled apart before anyone finished testing it. Evelyn noticed him lingering far longer than the other bidders, and something about his presence irritated her. In front of the gathered crowd, she remarked loudly that a single father who fixed cars on the side of the road had no business pretending to understand technology worth millions of dollars. A few people chuckled nervously. Connor Hayes, her head of engineering, added his own jab, saying that if the 5 vehicles still held any value, Carter Motors would never have thrown them out here in the first place. Evelyn pressed the insult further, turning it into a performance for the small crowd. She gestured at the 5 wrecks and announced, almost gleefully, that she would let the broken father have all 5 broken cars for $500, since clearly nothing else in his life had worked out either. The crowd laughed harder this time. A couple of people lifted their phones to record it. Mason stayed perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the 5 vehicles as though he were seeing something none of them could. He placed exactly $500 on the table, nearly every dollar he had set aside for emergencies. Grace hesitated for a moment, glancing between Mason and Evelyn, then confirmed the sale. Evelyn laughed coldly and told him he had just bought himself a nightmare. Mason only answered quietly that people often throw away the very things they never had the patience to understand. The section closed with Mason towing the first wrecked car out of the lot through the falling rain, Evelyn's laughter still echoing somewhere behind him, while ahead of him sat an opportunity nobody else in that yard had been able to see. Mason hauled the 5 wrecked cars back to a small garage tucked inside an aging industrial block, the kind of place with a leaking roof and dim overhead lights, where every tool still hung in exactly the spot he had assigned it years earlier. He lived simply, working long hours that bled into each other, pausing only to call and check on his young son, who was staying with a relative for a few days while Mason buried himself in the work ahead. He began stripping down each vehicle one at a time, and what he found inside surprised even him. Each car had retained a different piece of the original system. One held an experimental battery cell array, another carried an advanced cooling unit. A third held a torque control module, a fourth an unusual thermal frame, and the fifth carried locked software that nobody at Carter Motors had ever finished writing. Carter Motors, without realizing it, had built a remarkably efficient architecture and then abandoned it the moment their engineers failed to solve a single thermal synchronization error. Mason found the faint signature of a former engineer buried inside the firmware, a name he didn't recognize but a level of thinking he respected immediately. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that the project hadn't failed because the idea was flawed. It had failed because someone pulled the funding before the team had time to finish what they started. He didn't simply repair the cars. He began redesigning the logic that connected all 5 systems, rebuilding the way they communicated with one another, slowly assembling an entirely new central controller from the fragments left behind. He thought back to his own early years as a contract engineer specializing in industrial battery recovery, work he had left behind once his wife walked away and he became the only parent left to raise their son, trading a research career for a small garage that could keep food on the table. Lucas Bennett, an intellectual property lawyer who had once helped Mason through a minor dispute, stopped by one evening and warned him to examine the ownership paperwork carefully. If this technology turned out to be valuable, Lucas said, a company like Carter Motors would eventually try to take it back. Mason handed him the auction receipt, and Lucas studied it line by line. The receipt stated plainly that the 5 vehicles were sold as is, including all physical components, any internal data still stored on their systems, and full commercial restoration rights, provided nothing infringed on patents the company had already filed. Lucas realized immediately that Evelyn's team, eager to dump the liability quickly, had signed away far more than they understood. Mason decided to document everything from that point forward. He recorded each stage of the restoration, logged dates and times, saved every design change, and kept careful notes distinguishing the original architecture from the improvements he was creating himself. Some nights the work felt impossible. Wiring diagrams refused to make sense, components failed without warning, and the cold air inside the garage seemed to seep straight into his bones. Mason kept a thermos of black coffee beside the workbench and a small radio tuned low in the background, the only company he allowed himself during those long stretches when sleep felt like a luxury he couldn't spare. He began sketching an entirely new wiring schematic on butcher paper taped across the back wall, marking each connection point with a different colored pen so he could trace the logic at a glance. Slowly the wall filled with lines and notes until it resembled less a garage and more the command center of a research lab nobody had given him permission to build. There were moments of doubt, too. He wondered whether he was chasing something real or simply refusing to admit defeat out of stubbornness. But each time he traced the architecture back to its source, the pattern held together too cleanly to be coincidence. Somebody brilliant had designed this system once, and somebody equally foolish had walked away from it before it had the chance to prove itself. The section closed on Mason powering up a single battery module for the first time. A faint blue glow filled the dim garage. Standing there in the quiet, he understood that the $500 he had spent that morning had just become something capable of changing the entire direction of his life. Across the city, inside the glass towers of Carter Motors, Evelyn walked into a boardroom full of restless board members and impatient investors. Her company was in trouble. The new electric flagship set to launch in a matter of months was suffering from severe battery overheating, a shorter driving range than every major competitor, rising production costs, and a press corps that had begun sniffing around for a bigger story. Connor Hayes reported that his engineering team needed another 18 months and hundreds of millions more to solve the overheating problem. Evelyn's frustration boiled beneath her composed exterior, because the company no longer had that kind of time to spare. Samuel Brooks, one of the firm's largest investors, warned bluntly that if Carter Motors could not demonstrate a stable working prototype within 6 months, he would pull his funding entirely. Evelyn maintained her usual icy composure in front of the room, insisting she would not allow her family's company to collapse under her leadership. But alone in her office afterwards, staring at an old photograph of her late father, the weight of everything pressed down on her in a way she rarely allowed anyone to witness. Her mother, Amelia Carter, a founding shareholder who had stepped back from daily operations years earlier, gently reminded her that arrogance could never substitute for real competence. Evelyn brushed the remark aside, convinced her mother had simply grown too soft for the realities of running a modern company. Meanwhile, a junior engineer forwarded Connor a video circulating quietly within mechanical engineering circles, showing a man in a rundown garage successfully powering up a prototype battery cell that Carter Motors had thrown away months earlier. Connor recognized Mason instantly and felt a jolt of panic, because he knew those 5 vehicles might still contain internal data the company had never properly wiped. Rather than report the discovery honestly to Evelyn, Connor buried it. He had been the one who originally pushed to cancel the project, and he had no intention of letting his earlier judgment be exposed as the mistake it truly was. He quietly arranged for someone to monitor Mason's garage, hoping to learn exactly how far the restoration had progressed before anyone else found out. Evelyn remained completely unaware that the man she had publicly humiliated weeks earlier might be holding the very piece her company desperately needed. She continued pushing her existing engineering team harder, convinced the solution had to come from inside the building she controlled. Evelyn's office sat on the top floor of the headquarters tower, all glass and steel, overlooking a skyline that had once made her feel invincible. Lately, it only reminded her how far there was to fall. She kept a framed photograph of her father on the corner of her desk, a man who had built the company from a single assembly line decades earlier, and she found herself glancing at it more often than she liked to admit. Connor, for his part, moved through the building with the practiced calm of a man hiding something far larger than a missed deadline. He reviewed old project files late at night, quietly deleting anything that might tie his name too closely to the decision that had buried the solid-state program in the first place. He told himself he was protecting the company. In truth, he was protecting himself. The section closed on a stark contrast. Inside a laboratory worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Evelyn's engineers still could not solve the overheating failure. Inside a quiet garage on the other side of the city, Mason had already gotten his first prototype running steady and silent, with no fanfare at all. Mason realized that if he combined the data scattered across all 5 vehicles, he could reconstruct the original design map for the entire abandoned program. The foundational blueprint was still flawed, which meant he would have to write an entirely new thermal coordination system from scratch, rather than relying on what Carter Motors had left behind. He worked with an almost obsessive discipline, repairing customer vehicles during the day to keep money coming in, then disappearing into prototype restoration once night fell. The strain of running a household alone surfaced only briefly, a passing reminder of the stakes riding on every late hour he spent hunched over wiring diagrams, never lingering long enough to pull focus away from the larger story unfolding around him. Grace Madison, curious about what had become of the wreckage she'd sold him, stopped by the garage one afternoon and was stunned to see the chaos transformed into something resembling a genuine research operation. Mason asked if she would be willing to testify, if it ever came to that, about the condition of the cars at the time of sale, the insults Evelyn had hurled across the auction floor, and the transfer paperwork that followed. Grace agreed without hesitation, having found Evelyn's cruelty that day far crueler than the moment called for. Lucas began preparing the legal groundwork in earnest, encouraging Mason to formally name the new control system Reed Thermal Sync, a technology developed entirely after the vehicles changed hands and therefore entirely his to claim. Mason tested the first reassembled vehicle inside an abandoned industrial yard nearby. The car shook violently on its first attempt, the battery temperature spiked dangerously, and he barely managed to cut power before things turned disastrous. The failure left him nearly out of money, forcing him to sell off several old tools just to afford the replacement parts he needed to keep going. During a long, rain-soaked night, Mason finally traced the real problem. It wasn't the battery chemistry at all. It was the way the software prioritized raw power output the moment the driver accelerated. He rewrote the underlying algorithm so the system distributed load intelligently, instead of forcing maximum performance no matter the cost. The second attempt ran clean. The car held steady, the range exceeded every internal estimate he'd calculated, and the cooling system performed more smoothly than anything Carter Motors had ever managed with their original design. Mason didn't celebrate loudly. He simply sat behind the wheel, breathing out slowly, fully aware that he had just built something the giant research labs around him had quietly given up on. Lucas advised him to formally incorporate, both to protect the intellectual property and to give the work a name of its own. Mason chose to call it Reed Motion Labs. The section closed with Mason laying all 5 keys across his workbench beside the legal paperwork and the new technical blueprints. What had started as $500 worth of scrap had become the foundation of something real. Connor arrived at Mason's garage quietly, posing as a representative of Carter Motors with an offer to buy back all 5 vehicles for $50,000, framing it as an unusually generous gesture toward a man who simply fixed cars for a living. Mason declined politely, explaining that the true value of what he'd built couldn't be measured in a few tens of thousands of dollars. Connor shifted his tone, threatening that Carter Motors could pursue legal action if Mason continued using what he called the company's proprietary technology. Mason calmly produced the auction documents and reminded him that every page had already been reviewed by legal counsel. Connor left angry but unable to act immediately, which only pushed him towards something far more reckless. He arranged for someone to break into the garage that night and steal the hard drive containing Mason's research. Mason had anticipated exactly this. He had spread his data across several secure locations, installed cameras throughout the garage, and locked down his main systems. The intruder walked away with nothing more than a decoy drive filled with worthless old files. Lucas used the break-in footage as evidence but cautioned Mason against making it public right away. They needed to understand who was really behind it and why a company as large as Carter Motors seemed so afraid of a single restored prototype. Connor returned to headquarters and lied to Evelyn, claiming Mason was illegally withholding research property that belonged to the company. He pushed her hard, urging her to authorize aggressive legal action immediately. Evelyn, already under enormous pressure from the board, trusted him completely and instructed her legal team to send Mason a formal demand to cease all activity and surrender both the vehicles and the data inside them. Mason received the legal notice inside his garage and didn't panic. He understood this was the moment the story would finally be forced into the light. Grace warned him that Evelyn was an extremely powerful adversary, capable of crushing a small operation through media pressure and an army of lawyers if she chose to. Mason told her he wasn't fighting out of pride. He was fighting because of the work he had poured into those 5 vehicles, and because people like him were so often treated as though they had nothing worth listening to. In the days following the failed break-in, Mason changed his routine slightly, arriving earlier and leaving later, always glancing toward the street before unlocking the garage door. He didn't tell anyone how unsettled the intrusion had left him, not even Lucas. He simply doubled down on the work, treating every late night as proof that he refused to be frightened off something he had built with his own 2 hands. Connor grew increasingly desperate behind closed doors, pacing his office long after the rest of the building had emptied out, replaying every possible way the truth could surface, and trying to calculate how much longer he could keep Evelyn convinced that Mason was the villain in this story, rather than himself. The section closed with Mason signing his formal legal response, officially declaring Reed Motion Labs the rightful owner of every improvement made to the 5 vehicles he had purchased through a legal, unconditional sale. Evelyn invited Mason to Carter Motors headquarters, intending to pressure him into surrendering his technology cheaply before the story could spread any further. Mason walked into the gleaming corporate tower wearing a clean but well-worn mechanic jacket, drawing dismissive glances from employees who stood out sharply against the polished marble and glass surrounding them. Inside the boardroom, Evelyn sat at the head of the table flanked by Connor and a row of corporate attorneys. She kept her tone cold, accusing Mason of building a reputation off property her own company had discarded. Mason calmly laid out the auction documents, the bill of sale, his restoration logs, and his company registration across the table in front of everyone. Evelyn reminded him that he had paid only $500. Mason answered that she was the one who had priced them as garbage in front of an entire crowd. Connor tried to twist the narrative, insisting Mason had simply repaired existing technology rather than created anything new. Mason requested permission to display a side-by-side comparison between Carter Motors' original failed system and the Reed thermal sink architecture he had written from scratch. The room fell quiet as engineers studied the heat distribution charts, the efficiency curves, and the torque response data on the screen, several of them realizing Mason had solved a problem their own team had failed to crack for years. Evelyn, still trying to hold her composure, asked Mason flatly how much he wanted. Mason offered no number. He told her the technology wasn't currently for sale. Evelyn took this as an insult, assuming he was simply driving up the price out of personal resentment. Mason clarified that he hadn't come there seeking revenge. He had come to prove that the 5 vehicles were never broken. They had simply ended up in the hands of people too arrogant to look closely enough to understand what they held. The remark struck a nerve. Furious, Evelyn ended the meeting and ordered her legal team to prepare litigation. But once Mason had left the building, Samuel Brooks pulled her aside and demanded an explanation for how a man working out of a garage had produced cleaner data than her own engineering department. A few of the younger engineers lingered near the doorway after the meeting ended, whispering among themselves about the comparison charts still glowing on the screen. One of them, a woman named Sarah Whitfield, who had spent 2 years on the failed thermal team, found herself staring at Mason's numbers with something close to admiration, wondering quietly why nobody inside the company had been given the freedom to chase the same solution. Samuel Brooks remained behind after the room cleared, studying the abandoned printouts Mason had left on the table. He had sat through dozens of pitch meetings over the years, and something about the quiet certainty in Mason's presentation struck him as entirely different from the polished overconfidence he usually encountered from Carter Motors' own staff. The section closed with Evelyn watching through the glass wall as Mason walked out of the building, and for the first time, the look in her eyes carried something other than pure contempt. It carried the early traces of fear. Mason decided he would not let Carter Motors control how this story was told. He organized a quiet demonstration on an old industrial test track, inviting a handful of independent investors, freelance engineers, and Lucas to serve as his legal witness. Samuel Brooks attended secretly, telling no one at Carter Motors, determined to see for himself whether the rumors surrounding Mason were real or simply exaggerated noise. Mason brought out one of the 5 restored vehicles. The exterior still carried faint scars from its past, but everything underneath had been rebuilt from the ground up. Before the test began, Mason spoke briefly, explaining that he didn't have a laboratory worth hundreds of millions of dollars. All he had was 5 discarded cars, 6 exhausting months, and a simple question that wouldn't leave him alone: what if this had never actually been broken? The car ran its first lap without issue. The second lap pushed harder acceleration. By the third lap, the Forza surpassed everything Carter Motors had ever published about their own abandoned program. Independent engineers checked the battery temperature, the energy consumption, and the responsiveness of the controls, stunned to discover not only that the system worked, but that it carried genuine commercial potential, particularly for long-range commercial vehicles. Samuel recognized immediately that this could be the foundation the entire high-performance electric sector had been searching for. Word began leaking outside the small circle almost instantly. A few technology outlets picked up the story, describing a garage mechanic in Detroit who had revived 5 abandoned electric prototypes everyone assumed were worthless. Evelyn read the headlines from her office and felt her anger spike, furious that her own company was now being mentioned alongside someone else's success story. Carter Motors' stock wavered and investors began asking pointed questions she wasn't ready to answer. Connor's panic deepened. If Mason's profile kept growing, his original decision to kill the project would eventually be exposed. He pushed Evelyn toward an aggressive media counterattack, insisting Mason was stealing credit that rightfully belonged to Carter Motors. Evelyn appeared on televisions declaring that Carter Motors would protect its interests fully. But when a reporter asked why the company had sold 5 supposedly valuable vehicles for only $500 if they mattered so much, she struggled to give a complete answer. The section closed with Mason watching the interview alone in his garage, feeling no satisfaction in her discomfort, only a quiet understanding that he was no longer facing one arrogant executive, but an entire corporation now backed into a corner. Lucas dug deeper into the project's history and discovered that the original solid-state battery program had been quietly funded in its early stages by Amelia Carter, long before Evelyn took control of the company. Amelia sought Mason out herself after watching footage of the test drive, not to threaten him but to understand exactly how he had solved the problem her own engineers once abandoned. Mason explained the fix in simple terms. Amelia realized he had accomplished something the company's younger leadership hadn't shown the patience to finish. She told him plainly that the 5 vehicles were never supposed to be liquidated. They had been classified as protected research assets, but Connor had pushed hard for their disposal in order to bury a failure he didn't want traced back to him. Mason now understood that Connor's motives went beyond arrogance. He had killed a potentially successful program purely to protect his own position. When Evelyn learned that her mother had met privately with Mason, she grew furious, accusing Amelia of betraying the company. Amelia confronted her directly, telling Evelyn that her real problem wasn't Mason at all. Her real problem was that she trusted people who simply told her what she wanted to hear. Evelyn began to suspect Connor but still refused to fully accept the truth, ordering an internal audit of the cancelled project instead. Connor attempted to destroy the original records, but Lucas had already secured copies through the auction trail, along with a sworn account from Grace confirming everything that had happened that rainy morning. Grace testified that Evelyn had publicly mocked Mason, personally priced the 5 vehicles as worthless scrap, and signed an unconditional sale without any clause allowing the company to reclaim them later. Samuel Brooks demanded an emergency meeting between Carter Motors and Reed Motion Labs, warning Evelyn that if she still wanted to save her company, she needed an honest conversation, not another round of threats. Amelia spoke slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone who had spent decades watching companies rise and fall on decisions made too quickly. She told Mason that her late husband had always believed the best engineering came from people who had nothing handed to them, people who learned to solve problems because failure simply wasn't an option they could afford. Listening to her, Mason understood that the woman sitting across from him had spent years quietly mourning the version of Carter Motors her husband had originally built. Back at headquarters, the audit team uncovered email after email showing Connor downplaying early test results, burying promising data beneath vague language designed to make the project look hopeless long before it actually was. Evelyn read through each message twice, her anger growing with every line, not just at Connor, but at herself for never once questioning his version of events. The section closed with Evelyn sitting alone, reading the completed audit report. Connor had been wrong, Mason had been right, and she herself was the one who had handed a $500 million opportunity to the very man she had once humiliated. The launch deadline for Carter Motors' new flagship vehicle was closing in fast. Evelyn still insisted on relying solely on her existing engineering team rather than turning to Mason for help. During an internal demonstration in front of nervous investors, the new prototype overheated within minutes of acceleration. The system shut itself down automatically, smoke curled from the rear panel, and the entire control room fell into stunned silence. Samuel Brooks stood up and walked out of the testing facility, telling Evelyn he had seen more than enough. Without an immediate solution, he warned his investment would be frozen indefinitely. Carter Motors stock dropped sharply the following morning, and several outlets called it the most expensive failure of Evelyn Carter's career. Connor tried to shift blame onto his junior engineers, but Evelyn already had the evidence she needed. She fired him on the spot once she confirmed he had hidden critical data, mishandled the liquidation of protected assets, and orchestrated the break-in at Mason's garage. Firing Connor solved nothing on its own. Evelyn now had to face the uncomfortable truth that the only real solution sat in the hands of a man she had once mocked publicly. Pride held her back. Amelia reminded her that an apology wouldn't weaken her as a leader, it would only prove she still had the honesty required to lead at all. Evelyn found herself replaying the memory of that rainy auction morning, the way she had laughed while the crowd jeered at Mason. For the first time, real shame settled over her. Meanwhile, Mason had begun receiving offers from other major manufacturers. One international company offered $300 million for exclusive rights to Reed Thermal Sink. Lucas urged him to weigh his options carefully. Selling to a competitor could make him wealthy immediately. Partnering with Carter Motors could save thousands of Detroit jobs, but would mean working closely with the very woman who had humiliated him. Mason refused to let resentment guide his decision. Whatever deal he eventually accepted, he insisted it had to protect his creative rights, the people working the factory floor, and the long-term future of the technology itself. The factory floor itself grew tense in the days following the failed demonstration. Workers traded nervous glances near the assembly line, aware that layoffs were no longer a distant possibility but a looming certainty if the company couldn't stabilize its next launch. Word had spread that the garage mechanic from the news clips might hold the answer, and more than a few employees found themselves quietly hoping Evelyn would swallow her pride before it was too late. Lucas spent that week drafting multiple versions of a potential agreement, trying to anticipate every angle Carter Motors might attempt once negotiations began in earnest. He warned Mason that powerful companies rarely surrendered control gracefully, and that whatever deal eventually formed would need ironclad language protecting both the technology and the people who depended on it. The section closed with Evelyn driving alone to Mason's garage, no lawyers, no security, just a new proposal in her hands and an exhausted, sleepless look on her face. Evelyn stood outside Mason's old garage in the early morning light. There was no boardroom now, no team of assistants trailing behind her, just exhaustion written plainly across her face, more honest than anyone had seen her in months. Mason opened the door without surprise. He had known this moment was coming, but he had no interest in turning it into a cheap moment of revenge. Evelyn looked past him and saw the 5 vehicles she had once called garbage, now arranged neatly inside, each one playing a distinct role within the research system Reed Motion Labs had built around them. She offered her first apology, stiff at first, then slowly more honest. She admitted she had humiliated him because of how he looked, because she had assumed power and understanding were the same thing. Mason didn't rush to forgive her. He told her plainly that what hurt wasn't the $500. It was the way she had convinced an entire crowd that a man like him couldn't possibly have any value at all. Evelyn placed a new contract on the workbench between them. Carter Motors was offering $500 million, combining cash, equity, and a technical leadership role for Mason in exchange for commercial rights to the 5 vehicles, the integrated system, and Reed Thermal Sync itself. Mason read through it carefully with Lucas beside him. Buried within the language were terms that still favored Carter Motors heavily, slowly allowing the company to push Reed Motion Labs out of future production decisions. Mason refused to sign. Evelyn looked stunned, certain that no one in his position would ever turn down a number that large. Mason told her that a large number didn't automatically mean a fair one. He wasn't willing to trade away the soul of what he had built simply to make the figure look impressive on paper. Evelyn's composure finally cracked. She admitted that without Mason's technology, Carter Motors would lose its factory, its workers would lose their jobs, and her family's legacy would collapse entirely. Mason laid out his own conditions instead. Reed Motion Labs would retain ownership of the core technology. Carter Motors would receive a defined licensing period for production. Mason would hold the position of technical director over the project. Connor and everyone connected to the theft attempt would face a full investigation. A portion of the profits would fund a training program for young mechanics and engineers coming from working-class backgrounds, and the Detroit factory would remain open throughout the entire restructuring process. Evelyn was overwhelmed at first, but slowly understood that Mason wasn't trying to humiliate her in return. He was building something designed to last far longer than a single transaction. Amelia and Samuel joined the negotiations soon after. Samuel backed Mason's conditions completely, recognizing that they protected both the technology and the company's ability to actually manufacture anything with it. Evelyn eventually agreed. She signed the new framework not as someone handing down a favor, but as someone who had finally learned what humility actually cost and what it could still buy back. The section closed with Evelyn looking at the 5 vehicles one last time, murmuring quietly that she had once sold them for $500. Mason answered that she hadn't sold the cars. She had sold away something she never believed in, while he had simply bought back the chance she had thrown away without realizing it. 6 weeks later, Carter Motors and Reed Motion Labs held the unveiling of their new prototype at the Detroit factory itself, rather than some polished downtown hotel. Mason wanted the people who actually built things, the engineers and the factory workers, to be present for this moment, not just executives and cameras. Evelyn stepped onto the stage in front of the assembled press. This time, she didn't take the credit for herself. She openly admitted that Carter Motors had once dismissed a vital piece of technology, and that Mason Reed was the one who saw value where her own company had seen nothing but waste. The room went completely silent as Evelyn described the morning she had sold 5 vehicles for $500. She didn't soften the story or hide her own role in it. She told it exactly as it happened. Mason stood beside the new prototype, dressed simply in a clean Reed Motion Labs work jacket rather than anything flashy. The image suited him, calm, modest, and unmistakably certain of what he had built. The prototype ran its demonstration in front of the press, exceeding every performance expectation. The battery held steady, the cooling system performed flawlessly, and the driving range stunned everyone watching. Samuel Brooks announced he would continue his investment and was launching an additional fund to support manufacturing expansion right there in Detroit. Carter Motors stock began recovering, though the emotional center of the moment had little to do with money. It had everything to do with factory workers who had feared losing their jobs only weeks earlier now standing on the floor watching their future stabilize. Grace Madison attended the unveiling as a guest. Watching Mason on stage, she remembered the rainy morning he had stood quietly while an entire crowd laughed at him. Connor faced a full investigation and the legal consequences that followed. There was no need to dwell on the details. It was enough to know that accountability had finally caught up with him. Evelyn met privately with Mason after the event ended. She told him she used to believe leadership meant standing above everyone else. Now she understood that real leadership sometimes meant knowing when to stand beside someone better than you. Mason didn't grow cold or arrogant in his success. He simply told her that going forward, the company needed to listen to people on the factory floor just as closely as the people sitting in boardrooms. Reporters in the crowd scribbled notes furiously, several of them exchanging surprised glances at how openly Evelyn admitted fault. It was a different posture than the woman they had covered for years, the same executive who once dismissed every hard question with a polished deflection. This time she stood still and let the discomfort show on her face without flinching away from it. Backstage, Amelia watched her daughter with quiet pride, recognizing in that moment the kind of leadership she had always hoped Evelyn would eventually grow into, the kind built on honesty rather than control. The section closed with the 5 original vehicles placed in a corner of the factory as a quiet symbol, left intentionally unpolished, a few dents still visible, a reminder to everyone walking past that real value sometimes hides beneath a layer of rust. Months later, Reed Motion Labs had grown into an independent research center, partnering with manufacturing plants across the region. Mason never left Detroit, never forgot the garage that started everything, and never lost the simple, grounded nature that defined him long before any of this began. Carter Motors recovered through a new vehicle line built on Mason's licensed technology. Evelyn changed the way she led, setting aside much of her old arrogance, choosing instead to spend more time directly with engineers and factory workers rather than isolating herself inside executive meetings. Mason used part of his earnings to open a mechanical training academy for working people hoping to break into the electric vehicle industry. It was his way of turning a personal victory into an opportunity that could ripple outward into the community around him. His son appeared only briefly near the end of the story, a small model car resting on the corner of Mason's desk as a quiet reminder of why he had never allowed himself to give up. Evelyn visited the old garage one afternoon, where Mason still kept the original $500 receipt framed on the wall. It wasn't there to boast. It was there to remind him that people could misjudge his worth, but they never had the power to decide what his worth actually was. Evelyn asked if he had ever wanted to tear the receipt apart. Mason said no, because it reminded him that other people might price him wrong, but they could never actually take away what he was really worth. The two of them didn't rush into anything more than mutual respect and a growing trust, leaving room for whatever might develop naturally between them later on. Word of the academy spread quietly through working-class neighborhoods across the city, drawing in young people who had never imagined a path into advanced engineering simply because nobody had ever offered them one. Mason taught a handful of evening classes himself, standing at the front of a small classroom built inside the same industrial block where his garage still stood, reminding his students more than once that the most important tool in the room was patience, not talent. Grace stopped by occasionally just to see how the place had grown, often bringing along someone new from the auction world curious to meet the man behind the story everyone still talked about. Lucas remained close as well, no longer just a lawyer but something closer to a trusted friend who had stood beside Mason through every difficult turn. The final image showed Mason standing inside the factory, looking at the 5 vehicles that had once been thrown away, now serving as the foundation of something far larger than either of them had expected. Machinery hummed steadily around him. Workers moved back along the production line and daylight spilled through the high windows overhead. Evelyn had once believed she sold Mason 5 broken cars. In truth, she had sold away the most expensive lesson of her life for $500, and it took $500 million just to earn the chance to learn it all over again.